We have up till now mostly traveled in time, and this session we will travel in geography. And our first guide is Malise Rutten. Welcome to the stage. You are quite familiar with this rostrum, aren't you?
I've been here a couple of times before.
It's so nice to have you back, Malise.
Well, that's very kind of you. Really appreciate it.
You're always very welcome.
I don't do PowerPoints, but I very much admire this picture. Can we have it without the text? Yes, because that is related to what I'm going to talk about. All the Abrahamic religions believe in a transcendent deity who sets the rule of human conduct. In both Christianity and Islam, which has been my special interest over the years, virtue is rewarded with eternal life in heaven, while sin or wickedness is condemned to hell. However, there are very significant differences in the determination of virtue and sin. A key variable, I feel, has been insufficiently emphasized in the ecumenical discourses that talk about all of us worshipping the same God. And that key variable is the status of religious professionals and their role in the appropriation of transcendence. In Christianity, it was the church, and not the holy text, as in Islam, that originally called the shots, establishing rules of correct behavior and morality. A doctrine that endured even after the Reformation is extra ecclesiam nulla salus, no salvation outside the church, an inspiration to evangelicals who seek to save the unsaved, whether pagans or lapsed believers. It guaranteed the church's monopoly on granting access to eternity. The abuses of this monopoly, such as the sale of indulgences, etc., are well known, leading, of course, to the Protestant Reformation or the Protestant and the replacement of the false Church of Rome by the true churches of Protestant reformers. But it didn't actually change the doctrine of ecclesial absolutism. Although Martin Luther talked of the priesthood of all believers, he reaffirmed ecclesial absolutism, declaring that outside of the church there is no truth, no Christ, no salvation. In what might be called classical Christianity, including Lutheranism and the compromise cults like Anglicanism, which my forebears belonged to, salvation is not just conferred by belief, but by belonging to the church, the mystical body of Christ, i.e., membership of a spiritual body with its internal hierarchy, privileged status, and monopoly in the performance of rituals that ensure salvation in the afterlife. I became really interested in this when I was studying Islam because there was a sort of a priori assumption that Islam is just another version of Abrahamic religion. But in fact, the structures that flow from different organizational ways of promoting the faith are absolutely critical in my understanding. Islam, like Judaism, presents a significantly different model. There's no formal priesthood, but rather a community of believers, the Ummah, that is supposed to live by rules passed down from the Prophet Muhammad that crystallized into the Sharia, the divine law of Islam. In that respect, it has affinities with some of the Protestant sects, such as baptism, that emerged after the Reformation. The ulama, the learned men, issue guidance and the law. They tell you what the law is. They issue fatwas on particular issues and so forth. And the qadis, the judges appointed by Muslim rulers, enact the law through the Sharia courts. Unlike in Christianity, which has highly ritualized formal systems of ordination and consecration for priests and bishops, religious authority is conferred by a system of personal transmission, traced back to Muhammad and his righteous companions through what might be called master-pupil lineages. The process originated with the classification of oral reports of the Prophet's sayings and deeds, known as hadiths or traditions, with the integrity of reports' authenticity guaranteed by a chain, isnad is the Arabic word, of reliable transmitters, which is given as much emphasis as the actual content of the teaching. The form is as important as the structure itself. An isnad is like a provenance of a valuable painting. If you are lucky enough to own a Van Gogh or something, you couldn't actually sell it unless you provided it with an authentic provenance of the chain of owners going back to the artist himself. So the isnad is, I've often translated the word as actually provenance. In the course of time, this paradigm of personal rather than institutional certification applied to virtually every field of learning, as well as to guilds, crafts, and the mystical Sufi orders that dominated the pre-modern Islamic world. And this discourse actually became known as the Ilm al-Rijal. It means the science of men, although the system was certainly patriarchal under modern feminist activists in Europe. For example, it can be seen as more inclusive and not just male-dominated. One of the outcomes of the system is a certain sort of social conformity, whereby the doctrine of ijma', which means really consensus of the learned, and then can become more popular in terms of consensus of the people, emerges as the a priori for good behavior. And of course you then get arguments about sexual behavior, food, what foods you can eat, what you can't, and so forth. Although it's very interesting, a very brilliant scholar who died at a sadly young age of, I think, 48, he was at Harvard, Shahab Ahmed, did a massive amount of work recently, and he actually found that Muslims throughout the Islamic world were boozing much more than their modern descendants would acknowledge. And even before prayer, in the afternoon prayer, they'd have a good glass of wine. And of course, we all drink Shiraz, which comes from Persia as well. So there are implications of that in the modern Muslim world. If you look at the problem is you don't seem to have clear structures of what determines good behavior and bad behavior in terms of Islamic law. And it's very interesting that one of the most influential of the Islamists who dominated the sort of intellectual discourse, he died in the 1960s, Abu Ala Maududi, a sort of Pakistani theoretician. He comes to the conclusion that in terms of the Ilm al-Rijal, in terms of the science of men of good behavior, you can't really have a democracy where people put themselves forward, because that in itself would be seen as a sign of pride if you put yourself forward to be elected. So he said that it should work much more like a jury system of sort of anonymous plucking of people, and that way, provided those people have good social reputations, you then produce the good Islamic nirvana, which some of his followers still look for. One of my interests in pursuing this line of inquiry has actually been to challenge Max Weber's, or it's not perhaps Max Weber himself, but it's the popular assumption that comes out of Weberian discourse that the capitalist revolution of early modernity actually emerged out of a change in ethics, the so-called Protestant ethic, whereas in fact my research, such as it is, has, I think, helped me understand that a crucial variable, in fact, has been the way in which the structures of the medieval church were highly nuanced, but they had one very particular characteristic, was that they had a formal separation between the church as an institution and the lay public as ordinary individuals or citizens. And my thesis, which is been reproduced in one or two of my books, and I plan to do more with it later, is essentially that whereas in many parts of the Muslim world today, even now, with 2 centuries of modernity and of post-colonialism and so forth, institutional authority of the state is subordinated to tribal or dynastic power, whereas Christianity, by contrast, and I'm talking of medieval Christianity, pre-Reformation Christianity, built on Roman models of the public sphere to construct systems of governance internal to the church organization to some degree that resisted tribal dynamics, creating corporate structures that facilitate both state construction and ultimately the accumulation of capital. I got interested in this because the big question when I was first sort of coming to the study of Islam in the early 1980s was, how was it that a civilization that was so developed around about 1500, 1600 in comparison with, quote-unquote, the West, didn't develop a capitalist revolution or a scientific revolution? And you could, of course, argue that some of it was to do with Islamic inheritance law. When the wealthy merchant died, he was required by the Sharia law to distribute his wealth in proportions to his agnatic kin, to the male heirs, going down to often quite distant cousins and so forth. But I thought, the more I thought about it, because people doing Islam don't usually study Christianity at the same time. And what I came up with was a conclusion that actually the crucial variable was the fact that it wasn't Weber's Protestant ethic that generated the capitalist revolution, so much as the fact that the church structure of autonomous authority was secularized. So if you go, for instance, I haven't got the pictures to show it, but if you go to Holland and you see those wonderful Rembrandt pictures of the fathers of the corporations, the companies that were the sources of wealth, or even the great sort of iconic picture of the Night Watch, what you have is a celebration of the corporate militia, which is something which was alien to the Islamic discourse and the Islamic legal thing. There is no formally demarcated public sphere in the Islamic, traditional Islamic discourse. And of course, nowadays, with capitalism rampant in, say, the Gulf states and everywhere else, what you have is a very complex game whereby you have the formal production of wealth through corporate bodies. But in 9 cases out of 10, those corporate bodies are actually under the control of the tribal families, because Muhammad's utopian vision in the end went with the flow of tribalism, whereas what you find the Catholic Church's great contribution in European history, in a kind of a way, if you can see it as a contribution, there may be nuances about that.
We're running out of time.
Okay, was that actually the corporations, the corporate structures which enable people to transcend individual mortality, which is the absolute key here. The group lost, the brand lost. I used to give a lecture in the States trying to get the students to wake up and forget their mobile phones. I said, what you've got to realize that Jesus Christ was the first president of General Motors. And I think here in Sweden we could say, well, maybe also IKEA and Volvo. But the corporate structures which transcend individual mortality are the keys to the accumulation of capital. And that is the contribution I've been trying to make in both this seminar and also in other works I've been engaged with. Thank you.
Thank you, Malise. Malise, these organizational differences between the Christian churches, how does this affect the idea of virtue then?
Well, I think that virtue tends to be built in the Islamic world of the concept of virtue, and of course it's very difficult to make universal generalizations. But the idea of ijma', which is consensus of the community, is critical, and that tends to elevate, you could say, social conformity over individual morality to some degree. If you look at individual cases, of course, it gets rather complicated. You do have heroes who challenge the system, particularly in the colonial era, when, of course, the system, the ulama, the religious establishment tended to succumb to the blandishments of colonial authority and colonial power. And you had individuals who stood up against this, and they become, like Abdul Karim in Algeria and Tunisia, they become national heroes and seen as the saviors of the nation. But I think part of the problem there was that colonialism introduced modern practices, obviously, in the interests of the colonial power, but also to some extent in the interests of issues like public health and things like that. And very often the ijma', the consensus of the community, went against that. So you had a lot of leaders who used the social conformity, which is very strongly entrenched in the Islamic tradition, to resist. You've even seen that in recent years in Afghanistan, where programs for giving people jabs were resisted by local community leaders, because you haven't got a church which can put itself in advance of public opinion.
The little I know of the Quran, to me it seems like a handbook in attaining virtue. It's about your relation to Allah, and it's about your behavior in society. Am I right?
Yes, it is very individualistic, and because it's individualistic, you haven't got a corporate structure which actually determines what the good should be. And I think in consequence you have that sort of momentum of what we might see as sort of populist morality, and of the terrific parallels, of course, between evangelical Protestantism as you find it in the US at the present time, where it's, almost anyone can become a preacher, going back to the 19th century and so forth, and the kind of populist momentum that you find in Islamic countries at this time.
Great having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heartily welcome, Per Kassel.
Thank you. All right, so I just want to begin with an apology and a joke. So I'm not a philosopher, I am not an historian of ideas or a political scientist, I'm a legal historian, and I'm deeply concerned with questions of law and morality, as well as totalitarianism, which is one of my obsessions. Anyone who's familiar with me and my writings in Access would know that. So that's the kind of the apology. But I want to start with a joke. And this is a first page from a fictitious retrospective of the satirical newspaper The Onion. On the front cover of the 2nd October 1949 issue, it says that a giant poster of Mao seizes power in China. enormous placard now controls world's most populous nation. And the front story proceeds to relate how a mere advertisement for pork in Hunan province rose in size and prominence to seize power over China. And an enthusiastic commentator is quoted as saying, "This is one of the first times in Chinese history that we've been able to see one of our leaders. In the past, our great emperors were hidden from view in the Forbidden City. But in this new communist era of humble egalitarianism, the leader has come to reveal himself to us." Now, it's absurdly funny I find this particular false piece of news or fake news. It captures something very important about the contrast between the Chinese rulership of the past and the personality cults of the 20th century China, as embodied in this commentator. However, the idea that the Chinese leaders, or that Mao Zedong himself was an emperor, is very, very persistent. So if you would review political science or history or journalism, here represented by these three works, there's this persistent idea that these leadership cults that we have in China in the 20th century can be traced straight back to the sort of fountainhead of imperial Confucianism. So these are kind of three examples. The books are not bad themselves, but I find the framework slightly misleading. Because in ancient China, no Chinese would know the face of the emperor, would not know the name of the emperor. And if we, for instance, look at coins such as this one with the portrait of Gustav III, the culture king, it says very clearly, Gustav III, King of Sweden by the grace of God, and his motto, the fatherland, and we see his portrait. Now, by contrast, his contemporary, the Qianlong Emperor's coin, looked like this. And it merely states Qianlong currency. So Qianlong is just the name of the era. And then on the obverse side, we see the statement that this is minted in the southern mints of China. So this is kind of a very stark contrast, and I want to sort of explore the roots of this in terms of the Confucian sort of state system. So if we move on and think a little bit about Confucianism, we will understand why this is. So for instance, if you would kind of summarize Confucianism in like a neat sentence, it would probably be something around that the family is a microcosm of the state. That means that if families are maintained well through rituals, through filial piety, through the perpetuation of the species, so to speak, then the state is in good order. And that many of these family hierarchy is manifested through life rituals such as marriage, capping, funeral rites, the greeting rite, and so on. Now, in this system, the emperor is seen as the son of heaven. So the job of the emperor is to make sure that through the maintenance of proper rituals, the maintenance of filial piety, the maintenance of Confucian ideology, he is kind of taking care of the realm. He's responsible for state rituals. One of the most important ones is the worship of heaven. And you could say that if Confucianism is a religion, which is open to dispute, it's the religion of one person. There's only one person is allowed to believe in God. The job of everybody else is to take care of family rituals and not bother themselves with state affairs, unless you are recruited to be an official or volunteering to be as such. So that's kind of one thing of thinking about this. And this idea of filial piety being primary duty of ordinary people is taken so seriously that we can look, for instance, at this quote in Confucius, where Confucius is having a dialogue with the governor of Shi, who says, "In our village, there's a man nicknamed Straightbody. When his father stole a sheep, he gave evidence against him." And Confucius answers, "In our village, those who are straight are quite different. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. Straightness is to be found in such behavior." So the idea here is that you are supposed to lie on behalf of your family. The enforcement of criminal law is the responsibility of the state. It's not your problem, so to speak. And this idea was taken so seriously in the Chinese legal system that if you reported on your parents for a crime, you yourself would be punished. And if you reported falsely on your parents, you would be sentenced to death. If you reported on a crime that was true, that would lead to their punishment, you would be whipped, according to different kinds of legal codes. So this is taken very seriously. And so you could say that the fifth commandment, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, is taking precedence over the eighth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. So this is one thing that I want to emphasize. So how is this manifested in the political culture of the dynasty that I've been studying, the Qing dynasty? And I want to start or look at one of the most important hortatory documents of the Qing dynasty, which is the Sacred Edict, which was issued in 1670 by the Kangxi Emperor, who had just survived a power struggle and ascended the throne. This was at the time when the Manchus, who had taken power in China, were in relatively a shaky state, and he needed to manifest his Confucian credentials in front of the Chinese scholar gentry, the ruling class. Now, if you look at this document, it looks like a kind of a list of commandments or apophthegms of Confucian virtues. They can be grouped into several different groups. The first group has to do with filial piety and neighborly harmony. That is, to cultivate peace among neighbors, to cultivate filial piety. The second group of apophthegms has to do with moderation and economy, to be economic, to grow mulberry trees and practice agriculture. Then the second group has to do with heterodoxy and to maintain orthodox doctrines, to stay outside of law enforcement, to be courteous and polite in all manners. And then the final thing is to fully remit your taxes and to make sure that you do your duties to the state. Now, what is interesting with this document, and I've kind of doing some writing about this, is that nowhere in this list does it say that you should be loyal to the emperor. Nowhere does it say that you should worship the emperor. Of course, you should stay away from rebellion, you should stay away from breaking the law, but not primarily because that would violate the state, because it would violate your duties to your parents if you're punished. So this is one thing that I think sets Chinese Confucianism apart from many other doctrines. And you see where I'm going with this from in terms of the initial slide. Now, indeed, there was a kind of a worship of a placard in late imperial China. People were supposed to take part in reading rituals of this sacred edict. Here you have people lined up in order of precedence and virtue, worshipping this giant placard, not of Mao, not of the emperor, but of the sacred edict. So they're worshipping the virtues of the emperor as such, not as much as they're worshipping him as a person. So this is the closest you get to a personality cult in late imperial China. Now, this sacred edict became the object of a lot of commentaries. A lot of officials and scholars tried to ingratiate themselves with the emperor and with the government, and perhaps to forestall too many commentaries, the son of the Kangxi emperor, the Yongzheng emperor, issued an amplification of the edict, where he, in an essay of 10,000 words in Chinese, I don't know how many words in Manchu, explained each of these virtues to the common populace. And missionaries who came to China in the 19th century discovered that these kind of texts or amplifications were often extremely good for learning Chinese and learning Manchu, and also learning how to preach, because these were preaching documents where the emperor stands as a teacher of virtue that you are supposed to align with. Now, in this text, we find, for instance, quotes like this, which I think is another indication of how to think around this idea of filial piety as the central virtue. So here we can see in one of the commentaries, the Yongzheng emperor quotes the Book of Rites, where it says that the body is that which has been transmitted to us by our parents. Dare anyone allow himself to be irreverent in the employment of the legacy? If a man in his own house and privacy be not grave, he is not filial. If in serving his ruler he is not loyal, he is not filial. If in discharging the duties of office he be not reverent, he is not filial. If he with friends he is not sincere, he is not filial. If on the field of battle he is not brave, we talked about courage, he is not filial. If he fails in these 5 things, the evil of the disgrace will reach his parents, dare he but irreverently attend to them. So this is another expression of how important filial piety is in relation to duties to the state. So it's loyalty to the state, loyalty to the emperor or the sacred text is derivative of filial piety. So this is kind of one of the findings of my research in terms of thinking about political loyalty. Now, if we move on, we can see, for instance, this illustrated in family shrines, where the virtue of loyalty stands next to the virtue of filial piety, and in which also serving as an official on behalf of the family is not so much an expression of loyalty to dynasty as it is a loyalty to your family. You're bestowing grace on behalf of your ancestors if you serve the state. So I want to sort of conclude or talk a little bit about the conclusions to this. So one thing that I think I want to dispel in terms of thinking of public virtues is that there was no public imperial cult in late imperial China. And this, of course, stands in drastic contrast to most Western countries. We can kind of trace many of these ideas back to late imperial or to imperial Rome. The political loyalty of commoners was subordinate to filial piety. And if to the extent that ordinary people were supposed to be loyal to the state, it was more or less to stay away from crime, pay your taxes, do your duty if called up to serve the nation, but stay out of politics and above all, shut up. That is kind of the doctrine. And you can think of that, we were talking about positive and negative liberties, you can think of this as ordinary commoners only were subject to negative loyalty, in the sense that it was defined through penal sanctions, that if you were staying out of line or violating the laws, rebellion against the empire, then you were violating your ancestors. Now, active political loyalty is the exclusive domain of privilege of officials and banished service elites, meaning that it was only imperial officials that would meet the emperor, who would be privileged to speak to the emperor. This also applied to the Manchu service elite that were sort of framed as the slaves of the emperor. So that's kind of the positive side of loyalty. And this is where I'm going with this, is that it illustrates the limits of Confucianism as a heuristic to understand modern Chinese political culture. There is, I don't know how many documentaries I have watched, or how many textbooks where people explain the success of China or Singapore with Confucianism, and how many people think that kind of this ginormous placard of Mao or Xi Jinping is an illustration of an eternal kind of Confucian imperial cult. So that's kind of one of the ideas I want to dispel with this. And of course, the consequence or the corollary of this is that personality cults in China, and of course, I do not have the time to talk about this in detail. This is a 20th century import from Europe, very consciously. And the first time you start to see portraits of emperors on coins is at the end of the Qing dynasty, when they have to find themselves a kind of a counterpart to Queen Victoria. Later, of course, you have the importation of personality cult to worship Sun Yat-sen. So by conclusion, I think I'm running out of time. Mao Zedong was never an emperor. Neither is Xi Jinping a new emperor. And guess what? I think that this is not good news. And the reason why I think this is not good news is that the emperorship of late imperial China was constrained authority. Confucianism formed a kind of unwritten constitution that constrained the behavior of emperors, that told them what they could do or not do with their political power. They were supposed to be filial to their parents. They were supposed to carry out imperial rituals. However, the very positivistic Marxist doctrine that is enforced in China today does not recognize such things. So when we're talking about Xi Jinping and Mao as modern leaders, we should take that seriously. We're not emperors. Thank you.
Thank you. So loyalty has switched from family to the political leaders, that is the Communist Party. Did I get you right?
Yes, in a sense. And I could say that if you study the Cultural Revolution, or if you study the Mao era, they were trying to transfer the loyalty of people from the family to the state by demanding that children report on their parents. This was not, this is enormously painful for anyone to do, but if you're brought up in a culture where reporting on your parents was subject to criminal sanction, something that was within living memory of people in the 1960s and the 1950s, then that also shows the transformation of values in China.
But why is not Xi Jinping an emperor? He has granted himself lifelong power.
Well, I mean, there are other types of autocrats that have lifelong power. That are presidents or dictators or Führers. And Xi Jinping is not an emperor in any Confucian sense. He may be an emperor in a wider sense, but not Confucianism is not where we should look for the explanation of his imperial authority.
But how has this radical shift from family loyalty to party loyalty affected the Chinese people?
I mean, I think now we're kind of, we are 70 or 80 years into PRC rule. And I think, I don't think that Confucianism lives in China in any meaningful sense. And that if you talk to, even if you read scholarly literature, a lot of people have kind of forgotten how Confucianism wasn't just like a sort of fortune cookie philosophy, like do good things and be nice to your parents. It meant very real things in terms of ritual and law, things that concern me as a legal historian. And so it has been kind of be washed out of Chinese culture.
Is the hope of pluralism in China dead then?
Oh, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. As Yogi Berra would say, I would not dare to say that all hope is away. I mean, we have the example of Taiwan that has illustrated that it's possible to have a wholesome democracy in a Chinese cultural sphere. We also have the example of Hong Kong, and I think that's why they're so dangerous, because Taiwan and Hong Kong illustrate that another China is possible.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you. Jessica Fraser wraps this up with a quick tour around India.
Tour around India. Good, good, good. Brilliant. Lovely to be here, as ever. And I want to talk a little bit about Indian conceptions of virtue. Long ago, I was at a conference, and a very lovely Baptist theologian in Oxford said to me, "Oh, Hinduism, it seems wonderful, except it's such a shame they have no conception of ethics or goodness." And I said, "Oh, that's a big statement." He said, "Yes, it is a great shame. They'll all go to hell, but never mind." And I thought, "Oh, I'm sure that can't be right. I'm not sure you can have a culture that large, that robust for that many years that lives without." And I'll be talking about where I think you find cultures of ethics and virtue. And hopefully there'll be some ways in which this touches upon what we heard about Nietzsche, I think. I love that phrase, a rider on a fiery steed. We shouldn't restrain the passions, we should ride the passions, which will be fiery and strong, but they'll take us where we want to go, not where they want us to go. Put that there. So, in India, we're trying to look at the idea of something like passions that are wise, passions that are well-governed and well-directed, the moderation of the strong, as we heard Nietzsche put it. And we'll be looking particularly, I think, at the text that Indians often use as the major source of thinking about virtue, which is the Ramayana, the oldest of India's epics, around the same time as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it focuses on great King Rama, who is seen as the exemplar of all virtue. He's the ultimate king, the philosopher king, the yogi king, the ascetic, a king of restraint, of goodness, and completely unadulterated virtue, also we're told. And he's always aided by, on the one hand, his brother, Lakshman here, and his wife, Sita, who are supposed to be good sidekicks. They do what they're told by the virtuous king. Or so it seems. But I want to show that as India underwent its own transformation from the cultural dominance of the priestly caste of Brahmins writing in Sanskrit authoritative texts about the right social duty to pursue, from that quite orthodox virtue-oriented structure towards something different, toward a more complex culture of vernacular literatures written by the people, augmented through oral additions, becoming more humanistic, we see a shift from easy social virtues to complex spiritual virtues of a much more existential kind. So, on the one hand, the Ramayana is a story about controlling the passions. It's a story of good King Rama, and as we saw, there he sits, and he brings virtue to all. And his great nemesis, if he represents good virtue, is this character at the far side, Ravana, the great demon king. Ravana is representative of the opposite of order, of chaos. He has no self-control. If Rama trained as a yogi, lived in the wilderness, took on an ascetic life, he's a philosopher king, a yogi king, Ravana's the opposite. He has no self-control. If he has a desire, he wants to fulfill it right there and then, egoistically, regardless of all consequences. So he is the problem. And so it seems as if passion, as we might think from Plato, for instance, is the villain. Right? Excessive passion is the problem. But we'll see it's not so simple, because actually, in many ways, the character who becomes most popular in the Ramayana, in the hearts of Indians, of Hindus all over the world, is not Rama, the great king, who's rather austere, but Hanuman, his best friend and general, Hanuman, the monkey king. Hanuman is, like his friend Rama, a yogi. He's depicted often meditating, austere and strong in his body and mind. But he's also depicted as strong in his heart. And it's a very common trope in Hindu sort of iconography that you see Hanuman literally opening his chest to reveal God hidden there at the center. And there we can see Rama and Sita. And he's often shown as, interestingly, he's, amongst other things, the god of strong men. So you see guys in Indian parks working out and the muscles and they'll have Hanuman behind them. But he doesn't just represent physical strength. He also represents the idea that when those men come home to their mum, they'll weep and bury their heads in her arms and overwhelmed with emotion. And when they come home to their wife, they'll weep with love, and so on and so forth. So there's a strength of character on all fronts. Now, arguably, the Western axis of thinking about virtue is quite binary. It thinks in terms of good and evil, and this comes from certain sources in the culture. It thinks of passions, but also restraint, and we see that in the Platonic and Stoic heritage. It thinks in terms of pleasure and pain. If you read Jeremy Bentham or even more, it seems as if ethics is very simple. We want pleasure, we don't want pain. You just work between the two. And Bentham says the two things that govern all humanity are simply pleasure and pain. We're tugged on those two chains. And in some ways, romanticism comes in and complicates that picture and says, well, maybe pain can be pleasurable. Maybe pain can be worthwhile for the passions. Maybe passion is good even if it doesn't make us have pleasure, right? So there's a more complicated picture that the West has to undergo in relation to these things. But we'll see that the Western axis is not, Western axis of thinking about these things is not universal. That good and evil is not universal. In many animist cultures, demons can become good if you treat them well. In many cultures, heroes and villains are more complex. Sometimes the same person can be both. Right? Think of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Characters are struggling with complex forces. The passions are dangerous, but they're prized. In the warrior, the lover, a good citizen who fights for his country, and the mystic. So we don't actually want a world without the passions. And I've argued elsewhere that in South Asia, they recognize that you can't have a single set of values for everyone. There's a kind of value pluralism. There's no simple word for goodness in Sanskrit. There are other words that say many things, a bit perhaps like the Greek model. There is what it is to be a good citizen, a good father, a good wife, but no one concept of goodness. And so we have a very different picture from that perspective. There are many goals of life. And indeed, Buddhism argues that compassion is important for everybody. And we understand that pain is bad, but outside of averting pain, what you choose to do with your life, what virtue you seek, is very individual. So we get the first phase of thinking about virtue in the Indian, South Asian world. And that comes out of the culture of Brahmins, the priests, and their alliance with kings, the Kshatriyas. In the epics, particularly the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they come up with the notion of dharma. Dharma essentially means natural order, but when it becomes applied to society and culture, dharma starts to mean that order of society which we all should work to sustain. The most famous expression of Dharma and the very idea behind it is in the Bhagavad Gita in this section here. And we're seeing an idea that looks a bit like utilitarianism in the West, a bit like ijma, consensus in Islam, a bit like a social contract in modern society. God, Krishna says, so was the wheel of the world set in motion that the person who does not turn according to the wheel of the world, maliciously taking the senses as his pleasure ground, lives in vain. Turn the wheel of society. He who takes pleasure only in the self, and here it means the soul. They don't mean pleasure in other things, they mean pleasure in the very core spiritual values. Finding satisfaction in the soul, content in it, he knows no other requirement. He has no concern in works done or undone or in other beings. He does not depend on such aims. He doesn't require the fulfillment of pleasures. Therefore, what you should do is be detached and perform unceasingly the actions that must be done, your duty for your society. For the detached person who works attains the highest. Only by actions did exemplars of virtue, like King Janaka and the rest, achieve what is right. And here we get the core. If you look to the maintenance of the world, you must work. You can't let the environment fall apart. You can't let your country fall apart. You can't let your family fall apart. God says, if I did not ceaselessly engage in action, then people everywhere would follow in my footsteps and nothing would happen. If I were not to act, the worlds would fall to ruin and I would be a maker of confusion, destroying all beings. So we all have to act. We all have to stand up and turn the wheel. And so it goes on. Then there should be an awareness of what we need to do to support the functioning, holistic activity of society in every case. And that's what Rama does. And so here he is, and he fights the demon of chaos. And really, he represents governance as the indicator of virtue in the Indian world. Right? What it is for the whole to come up with a collective idea of virtue. Rama gives up ambition and love for the social order. He remains the motif of authenticity against corruption. A lot of people talk about Rama as what pushes back corrupt Indian politics. Gandhi cries, "Hey Ram," when he's assassinated. People translate, he's shouted, "Oh God, oh God." But what he actually does is he refers to Rama, the God of justice. And indeed, of course, he's become important for the BJP. A recent film that was very popular at the Oscars and on Netflix, RRR, involves the character turning into Rama at the end. And they sing, "Oh, Hey Ram, Hey Ram, Hey Ram." Most Westerns don't realize. I mean, of course, it's also controversial because this Rama has come to reflect a Hinduized India over against a pluralistic India. Right? So in some ways, it remains an orthodox conception of social good. He's the classic dharmic yoga king. Governance, order, and asceticism, self-restraint are at the core of that orthodox idea of what virtue is. But of course, the story is really more complicated. If you look at the whole of the epic story, the epic cannot tell its story without in the end saying, Rama's great, but he's a little bit austere. He's a little bit dry. He doesn't understand human virtues. And his poor wife, who he ditches because the public question her fidelity to him, and he says, well, I can't have a queen who will be questioned. I will send you away. She complains. His brother, Lakshman, who sees all of this, often criticizes him. And Hanuman, of course, is much more loved because he's clever, he's wily, he has an open heart, he has flowing emotions. So that as the story is written, the Brahmins try to, almost as a propaganda, give forth a clear idea of social virtue. But you can't write a good story without getting into the more human existential realities and that more complex picture coming out. The literature reveals human complexity. Other Ramayanas were written by women to bring out the importance of compassion, and in this case for minorities in the story. It's from the film Sita Sings the Blues. So oral epics, Puranas, vernacular poetry start to show that you can't have too simple and too constrained a concept of virtue. And this starts to come out. So there's a kind of organic diversity that emerges. India's growing literature is increasingly psychologically detailed and humanistic. You can't write a good story without that, like a novel. Cannot help but develop a more organic, complex picture. And from early Chankam poetry, which celebrated lovers and warriors as great heroes, through the stories of the gods, into tales, even in Buddhism, people start to unpack the value of wisdom and of emotion. We see that in the gods. In many ways, the Hindu gods represent different kinds of virtue. There's not one kind of virtue, value pluralism. It's going to be different for different circumstances. Shiva represents austerity, control, focus, the intensifying of your powers. And because of this, Wendy Doniger has called him the erotic ascetic, a paradox. You must both control and restrain yourself and intensify and cultivate your power, both at the same time. Right? Don't become a passive wet rag, become a strong and powerful tool for the good. Kali, was very shocking to the West, represents understanding and facing the darker, difficult sides of life, a robust kind of power that is not brittle. And Krishna and his love represent the importance of beauty, of love, of passion, of all that is bright and good and true, things that didn't fit into the old image of Rama, but they are developed now as new virtues. So what we end up with is a kind of meta-virtues. If you have many virtues that are brought out, what is the highest virtue that applies to all virtues? Right. Two things, which I'll end on. One that is promoted again and again in Indian literature is knowledge. No virtue is anything if you don't understand it, if you don't understand your situation, if you don't know how to engage it, if you are not wise, as the Engelberg Symposia helped to make us, then you will not know how to be virtuous. You will be a virtuous fool. And ultimately, that sounds nice, but it's no good. So knowledge is essential, and the gods explicitly advise understanding, as the goddess advising it. And the other virtue is control. But here the word control in English misleads us. It seems to always mean restraining. But control also means intensifying. So yoga is both controlling and cultivating your powers. To be a virtue, any value or state of mind or skill must be controlled by the person who possesses them. You can't be too passive, you can't be too passionate, but if you do if you do any of these things in the right way, they become powers, tools. So ultimately what you want is a meta-virtue of wise passion, of power and passion and emotion and care and commitment, but wisely moderated and wisely directed for the highest good. We all want to be the passionate yogi, and that ultimately, I think, is what India would direct each person in their particular virtue to become.
Don't look afraid. Don't look afraid. Be proud of what you have delivered. Thank you very much. Yeah, you did it.
Yeah.
Should we be careful imposing our concept, as of what you said, of virtue on Hinduism, because it's so different as it is? You said it's non-binary.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, the Baptist minister who said there's no ethics, he wanted there to be one thing, which is the good. And we're so shaped by Plato's idea that all individual goods culminate in the one good, and that becomes conflated with God. We can't get pluralism of virtues and values. It scares us. But I think it's good. I think it's actually much more human and exciting. Sometimes we're going to be lovers, sometimes fighters, sometimes calm sages, and it respects that.